Greetings. Today I'm getting the third video together to talk about some of the statistics and data behind COVID-19. And I'm going to share about what's been going on with the different states in the reopening and quarantine and how that's affected their growth rates of how many people have been getting sick. So you can hopefully have a little bit of a better perspective as to what's likely to happen to your state as you begin to reopen or don't. And so I'm going to share a screen here. And we'll look at a visual that I put together. So this is organized alphabetically as the lower 48 United States. And it's color coded. So states that are purple are states that never had any quarantine rules or stay-at-home orders or anything like that. States that have different colors, the light blue are states that eventually had a quarantine order, but before they had it. And then the dark blue is when they had a quarantine order. And then the orange is after that quarantine order began to expire. So no state has completely opened up saying, hey, everybody go to work, everybody do everything. You know, every state that's opened up has some form of restrictions, which I didn't distinguish here in particular. But we can see, you know, the trends that we've seen happen afterwards. So Alabama had a quarantine order and then it opened up a quarantine order, and you can see they bent the curve back here and then things opened up. They hit a bottom point and then they ramped back up, which is completely expected. The ramp up has not been extremely rapid. And, you know, so this is kind of what you would expect, and arguably even maybe what you would want is a relatively slow ramp up. I hope that Alabama, if this ramp up moves dramatically sharper, will begin to close off again. We see Georgia had a similar trend where they had a quarantine and they closed off. They were in the news a lot because they were one of the first ones to open up. They've also been a little bit sketchy in terms of the data they've been providing. So we don't know how accurate this is. Not sketchy in terms of like manipulative, just, you know, not extremely organized. And so things appeared to have remained flat in Georgia. And so it's always hard to tell what is because of legislation and what was just because of people's behavior. This is nice because these three states have similar trends. So Maine also had a rapid growth rate, you know, exponential one, then it very quickly leveled off after the quarantine order. And, you know, and we don't know exactly how much of this leveling off was because of the quarantine order or because people started to figure out what was going on and made good decisions. It's basically impossible to know. Although we will point at a couple examples that can help us to think about that. And then you can see that they started to loosen things up, and they're seeing, you know, a moderate to high growth rate. So I hope Maine keeps an eye on that. And if this continues to get real high, that they would, you know, start to pull back a little bit and, you know, play that dance that they call it. Nebraska has rapidly increased the number of cases. They did not have any kind of a quarantine, and they, I'm hoping that this is a flattening out here. It's not clear whether it is not yet. Ohio had an interesting pattern. They had a quarantine that flattened things off, and then it didn't. And then some kind of an outbreak happened. It could have been related to their being close to the mid-Atlantic region and people traveling or something else. And then they got that one under control, and so now they decided to open up a little bit. We're not sure where that's going yet. Texas is at a similar pattern, closed off, open up, moderate growth rate. So these are all kind of, you know, what you would expect, except for this little oddity here. Arizona hasn't opened up yet, but it also has flattened out and is currently in growth mode. So this is like a good example of a situation where you don't want to open up, right? They're growing, right? So you wait until you get it under control and then you open up. And then maybe you experience more growth and then maybe you pull back, but you want to at least have it be flat when you open up. Idaho had a really dramatic, you know, really high and then really down, and now it's flat, and it's still remained flat as they've opened up. Maryland hasn't opened up yet, same story as Arizona. Oklahoma is a place where they haven't had quarantine at all, but you can see a relatively similar trend to some of the states that have, which is interesting. So Oklahoma never quarantined, but you know, they had this rapid ramp up and then they leveled off, and they've continued to remain leveled off, and there hasn't been a renewed spike. And so, you know, it's interesting the way that's happened. Utah's had a similar pattern. They do continue to experience growth, but they don't have like a shift where it's like, okay, something changed and now they're growing. So it's interesting. You know, some of the states that have not had quarantines have turned out pretty well just with people's behavior and other factors. Arkansas had a similar pattern. There were a couple of smaller areas that had really bad outbreaks. And as those have begun to have gotten under control, they're, the whole state's looking better. Illinois has had a quarantine the whole time, except for very early on. They've had a lot of cases. It's finally starting to level off, which is good news for them. Alabama also had a quarantine. Looks a little bit similar to Illinois. Things have begun to decline there, so maybe they'll begin to open up soon. They haven't yet. And we can see, these few patterns basically played out all over the place. The states that you see consistent upward growth have not opened up yet. Virginia is a good example of consistent upward growth. You want to see the curve bend before you make a decision about opening up. Iowa saw pretty consistent upward growth and then has bent the curve even without a reopening. The one thing that's kind of fascinating is every state, with a couple exceptions, Florida being an exception and Georgia being an exception and Missouri being an exception, but generally, if a state had a quarantine and then opened up, we do see that there's, in most cases, an increase after the opening up. In most cases, it's not been dramatic. Minnesota's pretty dramatic in terms of the increase after opening, but they, made what could arguably have been a mistake by opening up while they were still on an upswing. So those are kind of the trends that you see. You see them played out over and over again. My state here of Wisconsin has not opened up yet. It's been on an upswing, and now hopefully we're starting to see a downturn where there's fewer and fewer cases, but there's also some legislative fights about whether they should be required to open up. For most of the state, the timing probably actually looks pretty good. If you were to take Brown County out of here, this line appeal a lot more flat because Brown County's had a dramatic increase. And so, that gets to the regional question. Do you open up the state outside of Brown County or, outside of the region that Brown County's in, or do you do something else? So anyway, feel free to look at this graph. I find it really interesting. I'll post it again in a few days as some of these more bars get in and we can tell what's happening with some of these states that have opened up. Wisconsin being a state that hasn't opened up yet, I'm really curious what'll happen. And I want to see how the other states have done. So that's it. There'll be more videos. Thanks a lot.